paper that has actually changed a little bit in its title and approach, and I'll explain why. The nice opportunity is when you give papers at conferences and you have people to actually come up to you and correct mistakes that maybe you didn't realize. And as you'll see, this is a method that I've not used a lot in my work. Actually, the only paper that I've used this method in before was actually with my discussant, Redfearn, and so maybe he had to go back to our previous paper and shake the dust off just like I did when I was thinking about this approach. So the idea is that we're trying to understand the relationship between household formation and unemployment rates, more generally how it relates to economic conditions. So the very straightforward question that we're going to address here is, how does the unemployment rate impact household formation, right? So that's a pretty straightforward question. And so in some ways this is a very tight paper. And it doesn't have a lot of complicated theory or anything in that. In some sense, it's also a response to some other work that I've done with Quan Lee. So we're going to try to answer this question: what's the impact of the unemployment rate on household formation? What's unique about this paper in the literature, as I'll say in a moment, is trying to think about, is this impact permanent? And if it's not permanent, how long does it take for the number of new households to return back to its normal level? Okay, so let me say something a little bit broader about where this comes from. Okay, so what we've observed quite clearly in the current recession is that the unemployment rate has spiked, and that this spiking of the unemployment rate, while it was brought on initially by a housing financial crisis, then now has circled back, and the unemployment rates that were caused by the downturn has now, circled back to housing, and so we, would expect there to be continued issues in this as the unemployment rate has fallen. So what's happened is you've jumped from a relatively low level of unemployment to a relatively high level of unemployment, and we're not seeing very rapid declines in that, right? So what does that mean for housing demand? Right, this is an open question. A lot of times people have focused on the home ownership rate or the vacancy rate as a way of measuring household demand. Right, and that certainly tells us something about how people are making choices, but one has to remember that a home ownership rate in some sense is in theory would be an equilibrium kind of condition, whereas the people who demand owner-occupied stock and the sellers of owner-occupied stock come together. However, of course, housing demand's a little more subtle than that, because people don't just demand owner-occupied housing, right? You're in the market just for housing services in general, and it can take different forms. And so looking at a home ownership rate itself is going to give one an incomplete picture. Alternatively, you could imagine the same scenario and make the same mistake if you looked at rental markets and looked at vacancy rates in rental markets and think about what the equilibrium housing demand might be, and you might look at changes in vacancy rates and say something about the health of the market. But again, that's also, it turns out, incomplete. And so as I've been studying issues surrounding housing demand for most of my career, it became quite clear that while I had addressed a number of issues that relate to how people actually observe their housing demand, I hadn't addressed in my work how household formation impacts housing demand. And so what this work is a second paper in a series of papers that I'm going to be working on over the next few years, really trying to understand how housing demand responds to changes in economic conditions. So specifically, the questions addressed in this paper, because it's the current recessionary environment, is the unemployment rate spikes, if things get worse, what happens? And so lots of things can happen, right? You can have people delaying moving out. You can have people doubling up. You can have people not getting divorced that might have gotten divorced otherwise. There's lots of possibilities in terms of what can happen. And it turns out this is really important to understanding housing demand, because again, without really thinking about housing demand in a very careful way, people can respond by creating more than one house, or more than one household can join up together, therefore occupying less space per person than they did before. But you can also use this time in an economic crisis to move from two small units to combining, in terms of economies of scale, you could imagine it, into a larger unit. And so there's lots of different ways that people can adjust. And so housing demand, if you look at vacant units or those kinds of things, you have to think about the whole picture. And so this is what we're going to be trying to do in this paper, and people have certainly recognized this in the literature, in the recent literature, is that people definitely change their propensity to form independent households. The other part of course, thinking about housing demand or demand more generally is it's certainly not just about your current economic conditions. So, I go back to my Econ 1 lecture or 501 here in the master's program or whatever we might call it. And you basically walk down and say, okay, what is demand a function of? Well, it's demand the fundamentals like the prices, the cost prices, and then you have your incomes and so forth. But the other piece of it is your expectations. And so a lot of what I've been trying to explore is to think about separately how individual characteristics and then affects your choices. But of course, what about expectations? And what does it mean to be in a recession versus just to have high unemployment out there? And what if you have your job, right, but then other people don't have their job? And so, there's certainly the probability of the future of your future permanent income that gets altered by the economic conditions, but just people's expectations in general might change. So there's lots of things that could affect whether people actually venture out on their own. Okay, so this is work by a couple of people working at Census, and what they've shown here in this graph that I've blatantly lifted from them for this presentation because I think it does such a nice job of looking at how economic conditions or how the number of households responds to economic conditions. So what we have these dark sort of shaded bars that are the recessions. We have the dark line, which is a percentage change in double-upped households, and this is a percentage change in total households. And so what you see is that, in this recession and this recession, you saw things not really moving a whole lot in terms of the number of households. You had a lot of noise in terms of moving up and down here. But what you see something that's quite clear in the current recession is that the number of doubled-up households has skyrocketed, and the percentage change in total households has fallen to a mere trickle. And so if you imagine on average, where have we been in terms of adding households? It was something in the order of about 100,000 new households a year. We basically haven't added households, or I think it's actually, I'm sorry, it's 1 million households a year. This is in millions, or no, these are percentage changes, but it is about 1.1 million a year. We basically not added households for the first 3 years or 2.5 years of the recession. So that's has an important impact, obviously, on housing demand. And so the question is, does it recover? Right, so here it's been kind of, in the past it bounces around and you have periods of low, periods above, but are we going to recover by shooting up here? And so that's, as you'll see, what we're trying to model here in this study.
What would that graph look like relative to foreclosures?
Well, we certainly know there's a big spike in foreclosures.
I'm just kind of wondering if that would be the unique thing about the most recent recession, not the depth, but the unusual number of foreclosures.
Well, it's certainly true. I mean, what I've done in this other paper, and I can talk certainly a little bit about it, is to go back into the 70s and look at recessions, from then all the way to the present using individual panel level data. And what we did in that paper was really focused on specifically on the delaying of young adults entering the market. Right, so now we saw similar phenomenon in terms of delays and in terms of doubling up in some of the past recessions. The one in 1990 and 2000 were relatively minor, and so while they were categorized as a recession, you just didn't see a lot of movement in the data. So it certainly could be foreclosures, but because that's another unprecedented spike. But what was really interesting here, I mean, in this current recession, just to talk about it a little bit, is that, and this is what actually motivated, this paper, was when you looked at the data, you saw homeownership vacancies skyrocket from relatively small 1.5% to 3%, 3.5%, which is related to foreclosures. You saw rental vacancies possibly also go up, right? But no one was really tracking where the households were going, and so that clearly meant that they had to be going somewhere. And so, one way of looking at it is how many have doubled up, and the other way is looking at it is how many people have delayed entry into the market. So I've said probably plenty about this first paper. There's a couple other studies out there that have started looking at this and basically confirm what I found with Quan Lee in this work, which is that household formation is negatively associated with unemployment and recessions. Obviously there's lots of other economic conditions, but that's been our focus. Obviously, if you have high growth or if you have positive income shocks, that affects your household formation in a positive way. There's been some other studies that have looked at the impact of unemployment on household formation that have focused on the younger households. In particular, the study that I had the graph from here by and I should have asked her how to say her name, but Mikita and McCartney looks at and finds a more significant impact on younger households in terms of the size of the decline in household formation. So that's consistent, but so far there's really been little known about the timing of when the recession hits, when the unemployment rate shocks hits, and when household recovers. So the genesis of the study was actually pretty straightforward. This previous study, which is still, under third revision, or actually second revision after being rejected a couple times at some top-ranked econ journals, it's I'm fighting it out with Journal of Urban Economics right now, hoping to get it published there. But this paper got a lot of attention in the press because it was one of the first to really highlight the point about household formation. And so I got a call one day from the International Monetary Fund, and this guy basically asked me, he said, well, that's all well and good that you showed this relationship, and in that relationship, I'm able to do what are called, for those who have an economics background in the room, basically partial equilibrium simulations, right? So you basically assume all else is equal, you can predict, but when you do those simulations, the problem is you very quickly get out of sample. And so if these are elasticities, which means that this is the effect right at this particular point. It's not if you blow it up 10% or 20% shock or 30% shock, you really are getting out of the comfort zone for us economists, and so it doesn't do well to say how big these shocks are, but they are illustrative elasticities nonetheless. Well, he said, well, policymakers, what they really care about is how quickly things turn around, right? So is this something where you need to have a massive intervention in the housing market to make sure that, the housing market recovers, or can you simply worry about other issues in the economy, and the housing market will kind of take care of itself? It's really going to be driven by new housing demand, and that housing demand might be different than the housing demand that was lost through foreclosures, because it might enter the rental stock, and then it'll take time for those who are renting to then accumulate a down payment, and then therefore enter the owner-occupied stock again. But no one really knew much about the timing of it. Okay, and so I recalled, again, that paper long ago, and I don't think I mentioned it here in these slides, the paper I had done with Chris back in, when did we publish that? Was it 2001-ish or something like that? Something like that, 2001, 2002? And we were asked to address a question where we were trying to figure out that if, the basic question there was, if you had permanent interest rate shocks, okay, in the housing market, namely if you pulled the GSEs, the government-sponsored entities, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, out of the system, would that affect long-term home ownership rates? Okay, or would it be a short-term effect and then you gradually got there? And what would be the path, sort of the direction of that effect and the path to get there? So that paper is very analogous to this in terms of understanding the timing. And so we did the work there. That paper was published in the JREEF, which I always forget how to say its name, but the Journal of Real Estate Economics and Finance, or Finance and Economics, Real Estate, Finance and Economics, that's right. And there we found that if you had the interest rate shock, in the short run, yes, you saw a reaction on house prices, you saw a small reaction in home ownership rates, but everything basically within, I believe it was a year or two, settled back to its normal level, right? And so what that meant was that having basically Fannie and Freddie subsidize the interest rate for purposes of higher home ownership rates is not a policy that's really going to be effective long term. So they might be doing what they're doing for other reasons, but for creating higher home ownership rates, that's not a good reason. So I thought of that paper when I was asked that question, and I basically said to myself, well, why don't I try that here? Can I get these time series data to ask the same kind of question and figure out, basically, if I shocked unemployment rates, how long does it take for the normal demographic pressures, right? So people, they can delay leaving home, right? It might take longer to get a job, and you might not leave home even if you got a job. But for those of you who remember, living at home, there are pros and cons to living at home. And at some point, you kind of want to leave, and because of financial pressures, you might not leave as soon as at other times, but there's this natural demographic flow. There's a flow from, as people, either get married or have kids or whatever the case might be. So these are pressures that are in the literature, which I'm not spending a lot of time citing here in this particular study, that have been shown to be incredibly important, right? And there's been a much more focus on household formation from sociology and life course and all these sorts of things than it has been on economic conditions. Okay, so that's where we were. So Jung and I went to gather data, and of course, in the context here, I have to say Jung gathered most of the data, and I had some of the data that I had on file for other studies, and we kind of put it all together. The way these models work, and I know that most of you haven't had any classes in time series econometrics. I've only had a couple myself. This is actually an area of work where like I said, I've written one paper that uses these methods before, so I am not an expert in this at all, but this is a method that is appropriate for this kind of question. And so what you have in this is that you have basically a set of endogenous variables that you know if one changes, the others change as well. And this is, akin to structural modeling to some extent. You basically are imposing a structure, and you're saying that these different variables will covary together. What you have to do in these models, as I probably say on the next slide, is you have to difference out the variables that are not stationary in and of themselves. And so we found, basically the number of households just kind of gradually goes up and up, right? But if you look at the change in number of households, it's basically a flat line. So that's what you can imagine graphically what stationarity is. House prices, also the rate of inflation goes up, but in the long run, you have basic stationarity around that mean, or mean that goes up. The same thing with population. And unemployment rates are, roughly stationary, at least with the lags. And then we included a couple other controls, the median income and the mortgage rate as well. Okay, so you do these Dookie-Fuller tests, and this is what tells us about what's stationary or not. This notation just simply says that this is stationary without any differencing, and that these series are stationary with differencing. So we're using a vector autoregressive approach as opposed to a vector error correction approach. Now, I'm not going to spend a ton of time on that just because our time is short, but what happened when I went to present this paper at a conference, they basically, the good news was a time series econometrician was in the audience, and he told me that there's a problem when you have one series which is already stationary and the other series which are different stationary when you're trying to actually predict the future and path of these series. He says if they're all different stationary, that's fine. And so the approach in the vector error correction model, as is discussed in the paper you looked at, is to find a co-integrating variable, or vector of variables that enables them to be stationary together. But what he mentioned to me, and we've subsequently, looking at the literature more carefully, saw this, that if you have one that's not stationary, basically when you predict in the model, it'll force the data to return to where you started, potentially. And so any prediction that we saw, like the housing market recovering, could have been just forced by the specification of the model. So that was very good, although slightly embarrassing, I have to admit, to talk in front of a room. He was somewhat nice. I mean, he's a European guy, so Europeans are known to be a little bit more snarky in their discussing comments. Like, he just kind of shook his head, said, "Come on, you know this." I'm like, "Actually, I don't. That's why I'm here at a conference to, receive my correction." But in any event, the vector autoregressive approach doesn't have that co-integrating vector, but as long as you make everything stationary, you can also link up the variables in this way. So it captures the linear interdependencies among the endogenous variables. And then what we're going to do, and this is really the interesting part of the paper, is to use these impulse response functions to determine how these changes in the number of households are influenced by shocks in the unemployment rate. So you do a number of other tests, you figure out what's the right lag structure. It turns out that, we, at least at where we're at in the research now, that it seems like 3 lags is the appropriate number of lags for these endogenous variables. And then we run the model. And here are the findings. So the findings are a little bit based on different kinds of data. So we have national data that we can run either in an annual format or in quarterly format. And then we also have regional data that I believe we can, at least at this point, we've only run in annual. I don't know. Jung, is it possible to do quarterly? I can't remember. I don't think we can, right?
We did both, but the problem is that we only have the number of households in annual data, so we can smooth them out.
Right, that's right. Yeah, so we chose not to split it up because then you're basically forcing the smoothing that, any economic change would not necessarily, have a causal impact on your linear interpolation. So we're going to have a little bit of mix in terms of whether it's quarterly or annual, but it gives us a sense of whether things are consistent or not. When you look at the model in the national data using quarterly, and I should have noted that here, the lag of the unemployment rate doesn't have a statistically significant impact, although it has the direction that you'd expect, where the lagged unemployment rates actually, an increase in the lagged unemployment rates will decrease the number of households entering. We see that lags in the number of households also predict, so there is a correlation over time, whereas things are going bad, then things continue to go bad for a while before it recovers. So there's a lag structure there. If you look at the change in the house prices, we found that the primary mechanism for predicting last period's house price is, this period's house price is last period's house price, which itself is going to be also related to these other variables in the model. But if you look at just the equation itself for the change in house prices, this is the only significant predictor. If we break it out into the regional, you see largely consistent results. Here, though, you do see the lagged unemployment rates predicted of the change in the number of households in the South and West. If you look at annual data, for the national, you'll find the negative impact of lagged unemployment rates is significant. Here in the change in house prices across regions, you see significant impacts across all regions. So largely consistent results in this model. So let me turn to the results, I think, which are of interest, which is when you shock the system, what happens? So this is the quarterly data at the national level. And what you see is, in the way that we've structured it, you look at typically a 1 standard deviation change in the variable of interest, here the unemployment rate. And when you look at a increase in the unemployment rate of 1.67%, you see that the number of households in period 1 falls, and then it continues to get worse. Finally in quarter 2, you see that the max it's still negative up through, I believe, period 5. So you actually are seeing, this reduction in the change in number of households that lasts more than a year, with a 1 standard deviation increase here. Now, of course, what did we have in the current recession? Not a 1 standard deviation increase, but probably closer to a 2 standard deviation increase. But this gives you a sense of just what the 1 standard would do. And what you see is that you do see a recovery period, but it's fairly long. Okay, now one thing to keep in mind is that this is a permanent shock in unemployment rates. So this is not just a quick shock and then you have the unemployment rate gradually improving, right? So if the unemployment rate improves, then you actually would expect to see an increase in the number of households, right? So what is interesting, however, is this says that, if you do all the math and so forth, it takes, years for the number of households to recover from those who didn't enter the market, but they eventually do get there, okay? And so that's really the big takeaway from this graph. You see a similar phenomenon, although, in some places you have, quicker catch up than others. This is annual data, so 1 year and the next year, the second year, you're, recovering already. The Midwest, not as good. As we've seen over time, the Midwest has continued to lose on a relative basis population to the rest of the regions of the country. Recessions have longer lasting effects here. And so the recovery, if you do the math, it doesn't ever really look like it catches up. There's a big drop in the South, but then there's a bigger recovery. You see the West kind of bouncing around as well. So the thing to keep in mind here, what I haven't drawn, that's always you can do, is to draw confidence intervals on these graphs. And so it's really hard to, once you look at the confidence intervals, really reject any equivalence across regions. And so, occasionally I'll use language that's causal in nature, but I don't mean it to be causal, say, hey, look at the the Midwest is so much different than the Northeast. The reality is, from a statistically different perspective, they're not. And so you're basically seeing similar patterns, and I take that as just evidence of again, the main finding, which is back in this graph, where you will see this sharp drop off. You'll see a recovery probably within a year if you have an average unemployment shock, and gradually the number of households will get back to where you were before. Okay, we decided that it might be interesting to test the model if we imagined how the model parameters existed prior to the current recession. So what we were concerned about is the possibility that the current recession would actually change what we were observing about underlying preferences that people had with respect to recessions in general, especially given that this recession was not a 1.6% recession, it was a 3-point recession. What we found, though, is that the basic model looks the same. So people's preferences probably didn't change so much. So the model parameters themselves, the estimated elasticities didn't change. You still see about the same kind of drop, about 250, 280,000 in year 2, and then you have that same recovery. So that addresses that hypothesis about did it change people's preferences? No, it doesn't appear to have changed people's preferences. So the next thing we wanted to do was to look at, given some of the results in the literature and given our own expectations, are there different effects in age 25 to 34? Okay, perfect. And so running the model, looking at the data just for those who are age 25 to 34. So you look at the population change numbers, you look at the change in number of households, you look at the incomes of that age group, all of that within the data. What we find is actually a very similar looking graph. You'll see this drop, and then you see the recovery. Now what's interesting, it kind of surprised us, and this is true in using the 2006, prior to 2006 model or the total period, is it looked like that the young adults, things happen more quickly. So while the drop, as we'll see in the next graph where we did it in percentage terms, is actually larger in percentage terms, the recovery is quicker in terms of, because eventually you just want out of the house, So even if the unemployment rate hasn't changed, eventually you just leave, after a year or two, and it doesn't matter what the economic conditions are. Whereas the overall population, you might see, grandparents living with parents and might stay there. Right, that's one way to interpret that.
If that's the case, though, and somebody doesn't have a job, right, and they're just sick of living with mom and dad, and then they move into a roommate situation, that would show no change, right?
That's correct, in terms of the total number of households.
Okay.
That's right.
All right.
That's right. And the previous paper that I worked on, the people that don't have a job, they're really not moving out. But what's happening is that people with jobs are really, just afraid. So what we wanted to do to try to figure out the relative difference between the total sample and the age to see how big these effects were, we did things in terms of growth rates rather than in terms of just differences. And so here you see the percentage drop in the number of households was basically 0.3%, whereas over here it was a drop of more than 1%. So you are seeing a bigger, this confirms the literature in terms of rates, a drop. But again, the recovery is at least as rapid. Again, you probably statistically, there's no difference when you draw the confidence intervals in terms of the speed. So it's just a matter of, it's deeper, but then the recovery happens just at the same rate, or perhaps faster, because this size is bigger than this one here by quite a bit. Okay, so then we finally wanted to look at house prices. I'll go over this quickly and just talk in conclusion what we feel like we've learned. So house prices, you have this initial drop and then this recovery. These are changes in house prices. So we haven't actually done the math yet to figure out whether house prices return to where they started or not. And so that's something that we have to figure out. This looks at the different regions, and here it looks at least like the Midwest is the most problematic, where it drops, but it probably never recovers, because again, in change of house prices, you don't get there. And then there's a lot of movement around here. Again, we can't really make a claim about do you recover all the way in house prices or not, given the demand, household formation that will eventually push demand into the housing market. So just in conclusion, and then I will look forward to all your comments, we do find that the unemployment rate shock has this temporary impact on household formation. The timing, if you have a 1 standard deviation of change, appears that the normal rate of household formation recovers in about a year or 2, so somewhere in that year. That gets you normal, but it doesn't necessarily get you recovery. So the recovery comes later, and this is even with a permanent reduction. We're finding that the unemployment rate has a similar effect on the change in house prices. The change in house prices probably also recovers, but there's certainly heterogeneity across regions.
So my job is discussing here is a couple things. So first thing I'm going to do is go through what they've done a little bit. Gary and Jung, I haven't seen Jung before, but Gary generally does very solid work. And so there isn't, I don't think, ton of sort of aha moments here where I discover the thing where they've done it all wrong. So it's generally very solid work here. So that's, I think, the first hurdle for being a discussant is kind of covered there. I'm going to kind of review it briefly. The second goal of being a discussant is to try to push Gary in a particular direction, make him think about other things. Some of the stuff I'm going to ask for is kind of on the impossible side because the data are just not that good, but it made me think. The third thing I'm going to do here is actually be a little bit selfish, and what I try to do is I want Gary's work to actually help me think about my work, so I just thought I'd start the discussion about this stuff. So, and you'll see what I mean by that in a second. Okay, so, why did Gary and Jung do this work? I mean, the first thing I think all of you guys should do is ask yourself the question about why am I doing any of this research? Okay, so it's a really, really good question to get started. I read lots of papers and discuss papers, and I get done reading it, I'm not so sure why I needed to read that paper. Okay, in this case, I know exactly why I'm reading it. The motivation is good. Family information is a big implication for elements within a larger economy. So, if you guys like about housing affordability, it has to do with how many get starts and how many formations occur. That's what it causes when prices rise. GDP ultimately, the recovery, all these things, the family formation actually is a big part of a complicated web of things that cause the recovery. So knowing formation, how it works over the cycle is a really big deal. The thing about this and what they've started to look at is they start with a national picture and then they then go into regions. They find the regions are different. I think this is very interesting to know. The Midwest doesn't recover in a permanent sense. And this is something we've sort of seen for a long time, is that that area's been, upper Midwest has been sort of declined for a while. And when you actually look through the data to sort of see in the results to see whether or not sort of consistent with broad storylines, this is the first one I looked at. So should we see a recovery in Detroit? Well, we didn't, and we haven't seen that for a long time. So it's nice to sort of see that sort of validated. The bubble and bust may be different this time. I think this is the part that I think I'm most interested in reading when I started reading Gary's paper and Jung's paper, is that the fact is that if you're building this model over a long time series from 1965 forward, you sort of imply that the coefficients are stable over time, that you're looking at measuring the regular response function over a long period of time. I think the real interesting question here is whether or not the bubble and bust are different this time. Martin asked earlier about the Depression. We don't have data for that. This is the first really big event that's a national one. We have other local ones that are strong, but this is the first big one, so I think it's very interesting. Okay, so how long will the response be? And how strong will the response be? These are sort of the material questions that Gary asked. Okay, so what do they do to answer these questions? So they get this. Gary didn't get a chance to look at all the data, but they gathered annual or regional data, or national or regional data from 1965 forward. And again, for those of you building data sets, this is really kind of hard work. Okay, so there's some things that are available for that time period, but almost nothing for great periodicity, and almost nothing sub-nationally in some data sets. And then when you do get regional data, you're not so sure what to make of it, and before that, state level starts to fall apart. So this is part of why he picked the things they did. The empirical strategy. Gary walked you through that stuff. He moved from the vector error correction model to the vector autoregressive model. And again, I think it's the right tool for doing this kind of thing, so I have no real complaints about this one. Okay, and then the question here is to look ahead. So what did he do? He found that he simulated a 1 unit increase of unemployment, and sure enough, you get the shock down. You get a bounce back relatively quickly, or quicker than I sort of expected, my priors were, especially because it was a permanent shock. I just, for some reason, I thought it'd be longer. So, and then the recovery starts at 3 or 4 years, and Gary was right to point out that the makeup from the periods in which you lost family formation take a longer period to occur, but the recovery starts for most places in 3 or 4 years. Okay, so what's my job as discussant? Okay, so the first thing is to raise challenges to otherwise good work. He's given this paper several times before, so he's gotten some feedback. My job is to sort of, make his life difficult. So some of the things I'm going to ask for he can't do, but I just, it's part of what we do as discussants. Okay. And the other thing I think is interesting is can you make the model better, make the data better? Those are obvious questions. Can you extend it in a meaningful way? And then what I really want to do is to try to push back and tease out whether you can get the underlying expectations. Part of what the vector autocorrelation models, you have this sort of big endogenous model, prices are kind of working and population's kind of working and unemployment's kind of working. The question is really what are the mechanisms that are underlying this stuff? Is it expectations formation? Is it wealth? Is it income? There's a marriage formation. There's a whole bunch of things that are happening in the background here that we don't get a chance to see in the data. And I think teasing that out and sort of figuring out what the things that are actually causing the underlying mechanisms are the interesting thing here. Okay, so what don't they do? Okay, so first things first is this is not, this is an impulse response function. So what they're doing is they're saying, given past parameters, if we plunk one variable, how does it perturb going forward? This is not a forecast. It's a really important distinction. I'll show you in a picture why it's important. They focus on a couple of key variables, but not all the ones that influence utility. So if you think about whether or not you want to move out or not, unemployment broadly speaking is broadly thinking. Is it, are you related? Are you employed? Or are you not employed? So it's on a micro level data set. It's a very aggregate level data set. And broad trends. And if you guys have seen me present before, I'm a big fan of digging deeper into local dynamics. And so again, this is the part where Gary's going to kind of smile at me and say, I can't do that. I know this, but I thought I'd show some pictures. Okay, so why not forecast? Okay, so here's the question. So why not forecast? Okay, a couple things. Is one, he's not really set up for, and the second thing is it's very difficult to do well. Okay, so I couldn't resist these pictures. So I love these things. Have you guys seen this one? When was this published? This was published in late 90s, right? So these guys said the Dow should ride to 36,000 over a 5-year period. Okay, where's the Dow now? It's a third of that now, and they still have jobs. Okay, yeah, probably. They're still offering strong opinions about the economic recovery. That's the other thing. So here's another good one from the Housing World. Okay, this is a great title. You guys have never read this book, and there's a reason for that. This is okay. But this was published in 2006 by the chief economist of the National Association of Realtors. So he takes it as his opportunity to go out and do some forecasting, and he gets eaten alive, right? So this is a book that's now permanently found on Amazon. He can't be forgotten. All right, so the reason you really don't want to forecast is, again, you poke around the internet long enough, you find some interesting things. So why not forecast is because you ultimately will get mocked, okay? So Gary's not forecasting, so he gets to avoid all this stuff. And if you look at these things here, I love this, kaboom. Okay, so what about the underlying mechanisms? So what he does is they've got this data set. We have unemployment, house prices, population, median income, and mortgage rates. Okay, so but what leads to formation? So I think generically we have this sort of, kind of theoretical model about utility. I will leave out of my house and from my current house when my utility is higher, and it's a nice generic utility function kind of way. So is it lower income? That means I can't actually afford the rent to be on my own. Is it wealth because I can't get a down payment together? Is it because I can't get married and therefore I just don't want to move out until I have to move out because it's easier to have my mom cook? Okay, so there's a bunch of things. So those things are not in the data set. Median income is, but not sort of specific income to me. So who's constrained in today's market? I think this is the part that's really interesting. They did a good job, I think, of sort of starting to look at the smaller, instead of the aggregate data, they started looking at some demographic stuff, looking at the younger people. That's because that's a different group with regard to wealth or income. Especially with regard to unemployment rates. So who's constrained today's market? So what I did is I thought we'd do is look at some other, there's a bunch of variables and I couldn't figure out which one to pick. I chose this one to choose as, of this list that's here, what would I want to include as an indication of a person and whether they were constrained or not? And I thought about this one first. And this has been and I don't know where this fits in the overall picture, but the idea is ultimately if I'm constrained, I have a huge debt burden over here, it makes me less mobile to move. And it's one of these things that we have interest rates out there, and we have house prices out there. We also have a bunch of people who have been living beyond their means for a long time with credit card debt. Are they less able to move? And I don't know where that fits in the model, whether you can have aggregate credit series in there or debt burden, but ultimately that's one of the things that I think helps guide. This data set is fairly long at the national level, I think, so you could include something like that in there. So Gary, what it is, this national data set, broad data set, and then what I wanted to do is ask you guys to think more specifically about things I've been thinking about, which is house prices and capital flows, and then also look more locally. Okay, so I think the walkaway point from the work that Gary presented with Jung is that it's very solid at some sort of national level. It's very solid at some sort of regional level. And the question is that really getting at what's causing the dynamics locally, and the things that aggregate up, are they like the things underneath it, or are we getting this mishmash of stuff within the region that's sort of hidden by the aggregation? Okay, so here's the picture internationally. These are a series of interest rates, and of course they've fallen over time. This is kind of a nice aggregate system. I wouldn't want to look locally at these things because these are national capital markets. These are sort of, the national sort of trends with regard to housing and commercial prices. Again, these are big aggregate trends that are found in Gary's data, and the question is what happens more locally. So what I wanted to do is look here first at the state level, and this is a little bit complicated here, but these are red to blue. Dark blue is being the biggest price appreciation. Red is the smallest in terms of single-family detached housing, I think, is, no, it's not, it's included attached, so just single-family ownership home. And the question is, what happens over time? This is my period. I picked this for the formation of the bubble. This is before the speculation really took off, but 2000, 2005, the birth of the bubble. So what happens here is, well, why is it going up here in California and Nevada? Why is it not going up in Texas? We hear about the Texas boom. Why is it going up in Florida? So there's interesting sort of geographic patterns. Within the upper Midwest, Chicago does better than the rest of the places. So we're starting to see some examples of the West looks a little bit different in some places. The Midwest looks a little bit different, but in general, a nice pattern there. The thing I wanted to tie this to is, what about capital flows? So if you look at these two pictures in rapid succession, there's a broad correlation between the two. It's about 65%. So here's exotic financing. So this is the rise of exotic financing. So in San Diego in 2002 here, the number of mortgages that were purchased with negative amortization or interest-only loans, that I'm calling exotic, went from 9% to 56%. So a complete change in the sort of the behavior about how homes were purchased. So if I'm thinking about with my parents and could I move out, before this period, I didn't have lots of options. Once the credit market starts to really get liquid and easy, all of a sudden I can start to move out. So that's a complete change in the way that I could change my utility function by going and borrowing 100% down loan at a very low rate. So, and the thing is, it doesn't happen everywhere. Even those are national capital markets, these kind of exotic financing didn't go everywhere. So again, if you're in Wichita and are constrained, the capital market allowed you to borrow 100% at a low rate. So why didn't that happen there? So I think the family formation question here is tied back to this question about capital markets and house prices. If you look within LA, which is the thing I've been working on recently, so I'm going to take a look at part of 5 counties here, just the centroids here. These black dots are the centroids of census tracts, so I'm going to look at those. And this is the total mortgage flow, so refinances and purchase mortgages normalized by the number of units. Okay, so the capital, the same picture I showed before with the interest rates falling and capital flowing into the lots of places, it flowed throughout the basin, but a lot of this stuff went on a proportional basis, went out to the periphery. So a lot of extra debt on a per capita basis went out to the periphery. Here's the number for purchase mortgages, and again, so it's even more severe here up in the north. This is Santa Clarita up here. Again, the basin where the house is already built out, that's not where all the capital flowed on a proportional basis. It flowed out to the exurbs. And then if you look ahead at what happened in price declines, again, I've inverted this so that higher spikes on the surface are price declines, so the higher the spike, the bigger the decline, is that you see big basin out there, out there, out there, out there. So you see this sort of capital flowed out, and then when the capital market pulled back, it left wreckage in its wake. Okay, so the question for us is, if you looked at this picture for a mobility standpoint, are the people here trapped where they are? So are divorces dropping out here so that people can't afford to have the divorce because they can't go to move anywhere? There's no wealth left in the house. So it's that sort of picture that I have in mind here from a local standpoint, and that we can't see in Gary's data, but I would love to be able to sort of figure out a way to tie these two together some way to see whether or not we could get marriage and divorce here, or new formation or new starts, or I'm not so sure how to do it, but I feel like when I read Gary's paper, I kept thinking I wish I could have that sort of analysis locally, and I'm not so sure we can do that. So, with the advantage, unemployment is a very relevant factor to family formation. Unemployment is a relevant factor for family formation. And the questions I have are these correlates or causal factors? And Gary's talked a little bit of that. Are they broad or local? And I think we've already have evidence that they're broadly true. And the question is, could we dig in a little more locally? Are they stable over time? The one question I had for you guys we haven't talked about yet is, are there threshold effects in all this stuff, or is it really continuous? So if you did a regression where you had two unemployment rates, one so they were within a half standard deviation, have a separate one with a bigger one, would the parameters be? And again, I haven't thought through how to parameterize that, but treating this one like everything else in the data is going to be a strong assumption. Could you test that, or could you make it more flexible? Our expectations adjustable. I think this is my favorite question of all the stuff. And again, I think Gary and Jung started talking about this. The question is, what is changing with regards to expectations? So when unemployment goes up a lot, does that change people's permanent expectations, or is it going to be something different? I don't know how expectations formation is going to occur there. And they started doing the work on the younger group, because I think that's definitely the more interesting one of the two. So one last set of pictures, and then just to tie it back again at the beginning. So this is housing starts over time, and it's very, very pro-cyclical. You can see the business cycles in California here. Starts go up when house prices go up, and the economy is better, and then fall when they don't. And then this is my version of demographics. And Gary does a lot more work than I do and stuff, so I like to read his papers, and this is my attempt at doing demographics here. Nice simple flat line there. But if you divide one by the other, you look at starts per capita. And the question I have, again, getting back to one of the things I'm going to try to push Gary on later is about regulation and all this stuff, is that the picture I see, this picture now is houses are starting but a much, much slower rate. And so the question is, what happens going forward? So if going forward from here, can you look backwards and use the parameters from your model in California? Again, this is just California. And can you use the same models going forward, knowing full well that there's an evolution that's occurring here that's moving to lower and lower per capita construction, so that there can't be as vigorous a spots going forward? And can you make that dynamic going forward to make family formation somehow be restricted because of the fact we can't build enough housing going forward. So that's it. Any questions there? Gary? No?